He built an empire on dominance, and never once considered that the quietest person in the room might be the only thing holding it together. Alpha King Kyle Thornridge rejected his mate like discarding a worn blade. No ceremony, no hesitation, just a cold signature and the assumption she would break, beg, or disappear into grief. She did none of those things. She signed back, in her own blood, and then she walked out of his kingdom without looking back once. If you've ever watched someone finally stop fighting for someone who never deserved them, drop your city in the comments. Hit that like. This story is for every soul who chose themselves when nobody else would. The throne room of Silverfang Keep smelled like cold stone and iron, the way it always did in late autumn when the mountain wind pushed through the gap under the northern doors and nobody bothered to fix it. 3 years Lyra Ashwin had walked these halls as the Alpha King's mate. 3 years and nobody had fixed that door. She noticed things like that. She always had. She was standing at the far end of the corridor outside the council chamber when she heard Kyle's voice through the oak. Not words exactly, but the register of it. That flat, dismissive cadence he used when someone's value had already been decided and the conversation was just formality. She had heard it aimed at border lords, at petitioners, at servants who arrived with bad news. She recognized it the way you recognize the particular sound of ice cracking under weight. Not a question of whether something was wrong, but only how far the fracture would spread. She pressed her back to the wall and breathed. The corridor was empty. The 2 guards who normally stationed themselves at the East Wing Junction had been reassigned 3 weeks ago. She had not asked why. She had stopped asking why about a lot of things. Inside the chamber, Seraphine Vale's voice floated over Kyle's with the practiced ease of a woman who had spent years learning exactly how to occupy other people's air. Seraphine was the daughter of the Vale bloodline, one of the oldest noble families in the Silverfang territory, with hair the color of burnt copper and a mouth that never stopped moving. Lyra had watched her for 2 years. She had watched the way Seraphine positioned herself at Kyle's right hand during councils, the way she restated Lyra's suggestions a few beats later as her own, the way she touched Kyle's forearm when she wanted his attention. Just fingertips, just a second, always deniable. Kyle never corrected it. Lyra had told herself for a long time that it was politics, that Kyle kept certain people close because they were useful, that his coldness toward her in public was strategy, not preference. She had built that story carefully, stone by stone, because the alternative, that he simply did not value her, required a kind of grief she had not been ready to carry. She was readier now. The chamber doors opened and 2 council clerks came out moving fast, not looking at her. Then Seraphine, who glanced at Lyra with that particular smile, small, symmetric, gone in half a second, and kept walking. Then Kyle. He stopped when he saw her, not with surprise. More like a man who had left something on a shelf and found it still there when he got back, slightly annoying in its persistence. "Were you listening at the door?" he said. It wasn't a question. "I was waiting in the corridor," Lyra said. "I was told you'd be done by the 2nd bell." "I'm done now." He moved past her toward the main hall. "Walk with me if you have something to say." She walked. He was a large man, not in the exaggerated way of the pack warriors who trained for mass, but in the way of something that had been built for actual function. Wide shoulders, a neck that carried the faint scar line from a border dispute 4 years back, hands that were always slightly rough regardless of the season. When she had first come to Silverfang as a young woman of 18, newly identified as his fated mate by the bond that pulsed between them like a second heartbeat, she had thought his size meant solidity, safety. She had learned the difference between the two. "The East Pasture Packs have sent another envoy," she said. "The 3rd one this month. They're asking about the grain allocation." "I know." "Kyle, the allocation was shorted by 30% last season. Those families are going into winter with—" "I said I know." He didn't slow. "It's being handled." "It's not being handled. I was at the Eastern Gate yesterday, and the envoy's been waiting 4 days without—" "Lyra." He stopped in the middle of the corridor and looked at her the way a man looks at a noise that keeps interrupting his thinking. "I have a council meeting in an hour, a border dispute coming out of the Greymore territory, and Seraphine has just brought me evidence of a serious problem I need to deal with. The grain allocation is on the list. It will be addressed." "What evidence?" Lyra said. Something shifted in his expression. Not guilt, exactly. More like the particular recalibration of a man who has been caught stepping onto a threshold he hadn't meant to cross yet. "It's a council matter," he said. "I am your mate. I sit counsel. You observe counsel." He started walking again. "There's a difference." She stood and watched him go. The draft from the northern door moved through the corridor and touched the back of her neck. She had stopped begging him to treat her as a partner approximately 1 year ago. Before that, she had tried everything. Arguments made carefully, proposals submitted in writing, moments of softness offered in private that he accepted without acknowledgement and never returned. She had studied every piece of Silverfang law she could find. She had attended every public function without complaint. She had managed the household accounts, resolved 3 separate disputes between pack families without bringing them to the king's council, and twice quietly intercepted correspondence that would have escalated into genuine crises if left to travel their natural course. None of it had ever been mentioned. Not once. She walked back toward the east wing. The meeting with the grain envoy took 40 minutes. His name was Aldrich, a middle-aged man with field dirt permanently embedded in the knuckles of his left hand and the slightly dazed quality of someone who had been treated like furniture for long enough to half believe it. Lyra sat across from him in the small receiving room off the east corridor, the one nobody used for official business because it smelled faintly of the lime they'd used to treat the wall damp 2 summers back. "The family heads are scared," Aldrich said. He held his cup of water with both hands like it might run away. "Not complaining, my lady. Scared. There's a difference. When people complain, they still believe something might change. When they're scared, they've already stopped believing. How many households are we talking about? 60-some families in the Eastern Meadow District alone, more in the outer settlements." He paused. "The old-timers say the land's been restless. Some of the pack elders are talking about the Luna Bond, saying the territory hasn't felt right since—" He stopped himself. "Since what?" Lyra said. He looked at the table. "Since you stopped coming out to the Eastern Territories, my lady. You used to come every planting season. 3 years running, you'd walk the fields, you'd sit with the families." He cleared his throat. "They noticed when you stopped." She hadn't stopped. She had been prevented. Schedules moved, transportation delayed, the quiet bureaucratic friction of a court that had been reorganized around Seraphine's preferences without anyone ever saying so directly. "Tell the family heads I'll be there before the first hard frost," she said. "Within the fortnight." He looked up. Something moved through his expression. Not quite hope, which would have been too expensive, but the nearest neighbor to it. She sent him off with a written commitment and sat alone in the lime-smelling room for a while after he left. She was 31 years old, and she had spent 3 of those years learning that love was not the same as mattering to someone. The bond between fated mates was old magic, the kind that ran in blood and bone before language had words for it. She felt it still, that low constant hum in her chest when Kael was near, like a string pulled tight. She had once believed the bond meant they were built for each other in some fundamental way that transcended preference or choice. She understood now that the bond was just the starting condition. What people built from it, or chose not to build, was entirely their own doing. She picked up the pen on the table and looked at it for a moment. Then she put it down and went to find something to eat. She was in the small garden off the east courtyard, standing with a cup of broth that had gone mostly cold when she heard the commotion in the main hall. Raised voices. More than one. The specific pitch of controlled panic that traveled through stone differently than anger. She set the cup on the garden wall and went inside. The main hall was not quite in chaos, but it was moving in that direction. 3 of the senior council members were clustered near the great table. 2 pack soldiers she didn't recognize stood by the main door looking like they'd been given an order they didn't fully understand yet. And Seraphine Vale was in the center of the room with her hands clasped in front of her and the expression of a woman who had practiced this moment. Kael stood at the head of the table. He was looking at a document. Lyra walked in and nobody stopped her. That was the first sign. When she reached the edge of the cluster and could see Kael's face, she read it immediately. Not shock, which would have meant he was encountering something new. This was the expression of a man receiving confirmation. "What is this?" she said. Kael looked up. The council members shifted. One of them, old Brennan, who had served 3 generations of the Thornridge line and whose loyalty was to the institution rather than any individual, looked at her with something she couldn't quite name. Not quite pity, more like the expression of a man watching a bridge fail that he had always thought would hold. "There are records," Kael said. He kept his voice level. "Correspondence, transactions." "What records?" "Lyra." He set the document down. "Seraphine has presented evidence to the council that you have been in contact with the Greymoor border faction, that you provided them information about our defensive positions in the northern pass." The silence that followed had a specific texture, not empty, charged, the way air gets charged before lightning. "She presented evidence," Lyra said. "Multiple documents, witnesses who confirm, let me see them. The council has, Kael." Her voice didn't rise. It steadied instead, the way a rope steadies when the weight on it becomes too great to move. "I am your fated mate and a member of this household. If there are documents claiming I committed treason against this kingdom, I have the right to see them." He looked at Seraphine. Some kind of communication passed between them. Short, certain. Seraphine reached into the documents on the table and laid out 3 papers. Lyra looked at them. She looked at them for a long time. They were good forgeries. Not perfect. The seal on the second document used a wax color that had been discontinued by the Greymoor faction after the border treaty, a detail that would require specific knowledge to catch, but good enough to survive a rapid council review, especially a council that had already been prepared to believe. She looked up. "These are forged," she said. "The witnesses," Seraphine began. "Which witnesses?" Lyra looked at her directly. "Name them." Seraphine's smile didn't waver. "The council has taken their statements privately, for their protection." "For their protection," Lyra looked at Kael. "You're accepting anonymous witness statements and documents you haven't verified against known faction records, and you're treating this as Lyra." His voice was patient in the way that exhaustion sounds like patience. "I've known you for 3 years. I know the kind of woman you are." The sentence landed in her chest like a coal, not because it was cruel, though it was, but because of what it revealed about the shape of the reality he lived in. He had known her for 3 years, and this was the assessment he'd arrived at. She was the kind of woman who could be accused of treason by a forged document and 2 anonymous witnesses, and it would feel to him not like an outrage, but like a conclusion. She breathed. "What are you going to do?" she said. "The council has advised." "I'm not asking the council, I'm asking you." He held her gaze for a moment. In the old days, not even that long ago, just 2 years, the first year when she had still believed the bond meant something mutual, she had thought his eyes were honest. She had read steadiness in them. She understood now she had been reading absence. Kael Thornridge had the calm of a man who had never been asked to feel anything that inconvenienced him, and she had mistaken it for depth. "Rejection papers will be prepared, Tiet," he said, "for the protection of the kingdom." Seraphine made a sound. Not quite a breath, not quite satisfaction, but something that lived between those 2 things. Lyra looked at Kael for another 4 seconds. She counted them without meaning to. Then she turned and walked out of the hall. The east wing at this hour was empty. The torches were not yet lit for the evening. It wasn't dark enough yet, just that particular gray gold of late afternoon that makes everything look like it's already past. She walked through it and into the chamber she had occupied for 3 years, the one she had slowly, quietly made into something that felt like a place she lived, rather than a room she was assigned to. The fire was low. She built it up. Then she sat at the writing desk and opened the top drawer and took out the small knife she kept there, the one she'd carried since she was a girl in the Ashwin territory, plain-handled, kept sharp. She had a document to sign. The rejection papers arrived an hour later, carried by one of the younger clerks, a boy named Peter, who could not have been more than 17, and who looked at her with the agonized helplessness of someone who understood something was wrong but had no architecture for intervening in it. He set the papers on her desk. He didn't speak. She looked at them. The language was formal and exhaustive in the way legal documents always were, wrapping a simple brutality in the clothing of procedure. It cited the evidence of the council. It cited the Alpha King's authority. It cited the well-being of the Silver Fang Kingdom. It dissolved the mate bond by the authority of the crown. She would be provided escort to the kingdom's border and a sum of coin considered appropriate for the severance. A sum of coin. Peter was still standing by the door. She looked at him. He was looking at the wall with the determined blankness of someone trying to disappear. "You can go," she said. "My lady, He stopped, started again. "I'm supposed to wait for the signed document." "I know." She looked down at the papers. "Give me a moment." She sat with the document for a while. She read every word, not because she expected to find an escape in the language, but because she had always believed you should understand completely the thing you were agreeing to. She read about the severance of the bond. She read about the escort to the border. She read about the coin. Then she picked up the small knife and made a clean cut along the edge of her left palm. Not deep, just enough, the way you open a seal rather than wound yourself. She pressed the cut to the signature line of the document and held it there until the mark was clear and definite and unmistakable. Not ink, blood, her own. Because he had taken everything from her over 3 years. Her standing, her voice, her proposals, and her work, and her patience, and her loyalty. And she was not going to give him her handwriting too. She blotted the cut against her sleeve and passed the document back to Peter without speaking. He took it with both hands. His face had gone the color of old plaster. She was already moving before he reached the door. She did not pack the things that had accumulated over 3 years. The tapestries she'd brought from the Ashwin territory. The desk correspondence she'd built into a system that nobody else in the keep understood. The 3 years of records she'd kept on the Eastern District families. She took the plain-handled knife. She took her riding cloak, the one she'd bought with her own money at the Greymoor market before any of this had started. She took a single leather satchel of documents. Not personal papers, but evidence. Records she had accumulated quietly, not knowing exactly why. The way you don't know exactly why you pocket a stone until the moment you need it. She took nothing else. The servants she passed in the corridor saw her and did not speak. Some of them she had known for 3 years. Marette, who managed the Eastern household and who had once cried at the news of a bad harvest because her own family was from the Eastern District. Old Tomas, who tended the courtyard garden and who she had found asleep under the linden tree one afternoon and had covered with her own cloak rather than wake him. Cessa, the youngest kitchen girl, who she had been quietly teaching to read on the evenings when neither of them had anything else urgent. She did not stop to say goodbye. Not because she didn't want to, but because goodbyes required time, and time was the one thing she couldn't afford to give them without it costing her the only advantage she had left, which was the exit she was taking before anyone could reconsider letting her take it. She reached the stables. Her horse, the gray mare she'd named Ashrock because of the color and because the name made people underestimate her, had been brushed that morning. Someone had left a travel pack already hung from the saddle. She didn't know who. She chose not to look at it too closely because if she recognized the hands that packed it, she would have to feel something about it, and she was keeping her feelings in a very specific container right now. She mounted up. She rode through the east gate. The gate guard was a man called Fenwick, thick-necked and steady, 10 years in his post. He watched her come through. He looked at her face. He looked at the satchel at her side. "My lady," he said. "Fenwick." She stopped the horse. "The next time someone from the Eastern District comes to the gate with a grievance, don't make them wait. You understand?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Yes, my lady," he said. She rode through. The road north out of Silver Fang Keep ran along the ridge for the first 3 miles before it dropped into the valley and split. East toward the trade route, west toward the outer settlements, north toward the territories that began past the Stonemark crossing. She took it at a pace that covered ground without announcing urgency. The mare was steady under her. The sky had gone to the deep blue-gray of early evening, that particular color that carried cold in it before the cold fully arrived. She did not look back. She had learned that early, one of the first things you learned in the Ashwin territory, where the land was thin and the winters were honest about what they were. You spent your energy on what was in front of you. Looking back at things you couldn't change was a luxury for people who had energy to waste and she had never been one of those people. The bond in her chest was still there. It was the worst part. The rejection papers were legally binding. The council had witnessed the document, and the magic of the bond was older than any legal framework, which meant it did not care about paperwork. It still hummed. Quieter, maybe. Already beginning the slow dissolution that would take weeks or months, the way a fire takes time to become ash even after you stop feeding it. But there. She breathed through it. She had a plan. She had, in fact, had a plan for longer than she wanted to admit to herself. Not because she had known this moment would come, exactly, but because she was the kind of person who prepared for the worst not out of pessimism, but out of respect for the shape of reality. The satchel at her side contained records that would matter. The contacts she had built quietly in the Northern Territories. The pack families who had sent their grain envoys not to Kael, but to her. The 3 separate instances of Seraphine's interference in Eastern District resource allocation that she had documented with dates and names. None of that was accidental. None of it was desperation. She had been building something in the spaces Kael had dismissed. She had just not known yet what it was. The road ahead was dark now, and the stars were beginning to come through. Ashrock moved under her with the steady sureness of a horse that trusted her rider, and Lyra let her find the pace. Behind her, somewhere back along the ridge, the lights of Silverfang Keep were just visible. She did not look back. What she did not know, could not have known, because it had not happened yet, was that the grain envoy Aldrich, upon returning to the Eastern District that evening, would find 3 of his neighbors' fields showing the first signs of a withering that hadn't touched Silverfang territory in 40 years. What she did not know was that in the council chamber she had just left, Brennan, the old councilman, had returned after she departed and asked for the originating seal on Seraphine's documentation and had been refused access and had sat with that refusal for a long time in the darkened room with an expression that was not quite fear, but was its nearest neighbor. What she did not know was that Kyle Thornridge, standing in his study 1 hour after she rode out the east gate, had looked down at the signed rejection document, the one with her blood on the signature line instead of ink, and had felt something move through his chest that he did not have a word for yet. A kind of subtraction, as if something had been present for 3 years so constantly he had stopped registering it, and now its absence was a new texture in the air, a cold draft from somewhere he couldn't locate. He told himself it was relief. He stood at the window and watched the first full dark come over the Silverfang Ridge, and he told himself it was relief. And the draft kept moving through the study, and the rejection document with its blood signature sat on the desk behind him, and somewhere north of the ridge Lyra Ashwin was already past the Stonemark crossing. She was not coming back. He did not know yet what that meant. He would. The withering started in the eastern fields on the 3rd day after Lyra rode out the gate. Aldrich noticed it first, not the plants themselves, but the smell. Wrong season for rot, wrong weather for blight, and yet there it was in the low morning air when he walked the perimeter of the Hartwell family's south pasture. Something brackish and ancient, like water that had been standing too long in a dark place. He crouched and put his hand flat to the ground the way his grandfather had taught him. The soil was cold, not frost cold, cold in the other way, the way that meant the land wasn't moving underneath, wasn't breathing, wasn't doing the slow, invisible work that land was supposed to do. He sent a rider to the keep that afternoon. The rider waited 2 days for an audience. In the keep itself, nobody was paying attention to soil temperatures. Kale had spent those same 2 days running a different kind of damage, the kind that came from moving too fast on a decision and discovering the ground beneath it was thinner than expected. 3 of the council members had requested a formal review of Seraphine's documentation. Not a challenge, exactly. More the bureaucratic version of a man clearing his throat. Old Brennan had put it in writing, which meant it was now a record, which meant it could not be quietly ignored. Kyle sat at the council table on the morning of the 3rd day and looked at Brennan across the length of it. "You want to review the evidence?" Kyle said. "I want to ensure the process was complete," Brennan said. He was 71 years old and had survived 3 kings by being precise about his language. "There is a difference." The process was complete. The originating seal on 2 of the documents has not been independently verified against the Greymore faction archives. Brennan set his hands flat on the table. That verification takes 3 days. It costs nothing, and it would close this question entirely. From her seat at Kael's right, Seraphine said, "The council voted." "The council voted based on what was presented," Brennan said, still looking at Kael. "I'm asking what was presented to be confirmed. That is not a challenge to the vote. It is standard practice for any treason determination." Seraphine's voice stayed smooth. "The witnesses are protected." "I'm not asking about the witnesses." Brennan finally looked at her. Something in his expression was very still, the way old things get still when they've stopped being surprised. "I'm asking about the seals." The silence that followed had a specific shape, the shape of a question that had been asked in a room where nobody wanted to answer it. Kael said, "I'll take it under advisement." Brennan looked at him for a long moment. Then he wrote something in the margin of the document in front of him, capped his pen, and said nothing further. After the council dispersed, Seraphine fell into step with Kael in the corridor. She had a quality of motion that suggested she was always moving toward something she'd already decided on. No hesitation, no checking of pace. She had built that quality deliberately. Kael had watched it get refined over 2 years without recognizing what the refinement was for. "Brennan is going to keep pulling at this," she said. "I know. He doesn't have the evidence to overturn—" "I said I know." He stopped walking. "What I need to understand is whether there's anything in those documents that won't survive verification." She looked at him. Her expression didn't change, but something behind it did. A tiny recalibration, the kind that happens when a calculation comes back differently than expected. "The documents are solid," she said. "That's not an answer to my question." "Kael." She put her hand on his forearm. Just fingertips, just a second, the way she always did. Lyra was a liability. She was in contact with people outside this kingdom who did not have our interests at, was she? The words came out flatter than he intended. Seraphine heard the flatness. Her hand came off his arm. "The witnesses are anonymous." He looked down the corridor at nothing in particular. "Which means they're yours." The word yours sat between them like a stone dropped in still water. "I acted in the kingdom's interest," Seraphine said. Her voice had gone very precise, the way precision works when emotion is being managed out of a conversation rather than expressed in it. "I acted in your interest." "I know what you acted in." He walked away. She let him go, which was itself a kind of answer. The writer from the Eastern District finally got his audience that afternoon. He was young, road-dusty, and he had the quality of someone who had rehearsed what he was going to say and was trying to remember the order of it under pressure. He told Kael about the soil. He told him about the smell in the morning air. He told him that 3 other families had reported similar things, that the pack elders were talking, that the word they kept using was the same word, unbalanced, that the land felt unbalanced. Kael sent him away with assurances that a survey team would be dispatched. He sat alone in the study afterward. The rejection document was still on the desk. He had not moved it. He was not sure why he had not moved it. He had told himself it was oversight, the way you tell yourself things that require no further examination. He looked at the blood signature. He had been mated to Lyra Ashwin for 3 years. He knew, in the factual way of knowing things about a person who shares your space, a series of surface details. That she woke early, that she kept the small knife, that she had a quality of stillness in meetings that some of the council members had read as passivity, and that he had read the same way for too long before he'd started to understand it was something else. Not passivity, attention. She had been paying attention to everything in every room she walked into, quietly, without performance, for 3 years, and he had looked at that attention and called it small. He pressed the heel of his hand to his sternum. The bond was still there. That was the thing about rejection papers. The legal mechanism was immediate, but the biology took its own time. He could still feel the faint register of her presence, just the edge of it, already distant, moving away like heat leaving a room after the fire goes out. He pulled his hand away from his chest and went to find his war marshal. The war marshal's name was Davin, a lean, gray-templed man who had the specific quality of soldiers who had survived long enough to stop being impressed by most things. He received Kael's request for a northern border assessment without expression, and said he'd have preliminary numbers by morning. I also need you to find someone, Kyle said. Davin waited. Lara Ashwin. Former... He stopped. The word sat wrong in his mouth. She left through the east gate 4 days ago, heading north. I need to know where she went. Davin looked at him for a moment. Not judgment. Davin didn't do judgment, or at least had learned not to show it. Tracking or locating? Locating. I want to know where she is, that's all. That's all, Davin said, in the tone of a man noting a discrepancy without commenting on it. Is there a problem? No problem. Davin wrote something in his field book. 3 days, maybe 4 if she went into the Stonemark passes. Kyle nodded and left. In the corridor outside, he passed one of the kitchen girls. Small, young, carrying a stack of books with the intense concentration of someone who had been entrusted with something valuable. She looked up at him. Then she looked away. And something in the speed of that looking away caught him, because it wasn't the reflex of deference. It was something closer to the specific withdrawal of a person who has decided you are not worth looking at. He turned back. Where did you get those? The girl stopped. Her hands tightened on the books. The Lady Lyra, sir. She was teaching me. She left them for me. A beat. Before she went. He stood in the corridor looking at the books in the girl's arms. Worn copies, the kind that had been read and reread. He felt something shift in his chest that was not the bond, more like the sensation of a door opening onto a room you hadn't known existed, and not liking what the dimensions of it implied about the size of the house you thought you were living in. He walked away without speaking. That night, the first report came in from the Western Packs, not about the soil this time, about water. A tributary that fed 3 settlements had dropped to a quarter of its normal late-season flow. The pack heads were calling it weather. The elders were calling it something else. Seraphine came to his study uninvited at the 2nd hour past dark. She moved through the room with the confidence of a woman who had decided her access was already established, already a fact, already a thing that didn't require asking for. She poured 2 cups from the carafe on the side table and set one in front of him. The council review, she said. Brennan's going to push for it at the next session. I know. If the seals are tested, she stopped, started differently. If there are questions about the documentation, it could be used to undermine the legitimacy of everything the council voted on, not just the rejection. The trade agreements Seraphine brokered, she caught herself. The agreements I brokered with the Southern Territories last season. It opens everything. He looked at the cup she'd set in front of him. He did not pick it up. Seraphine, he said, when you brought the documentation to the council, was there anything in those documents that you created? The silence was very brief. If he had been less tired, he might have missed it. I compiled intelligence from multiple sources, she said. The synthesis was mine. The underlying information. I'm not asking about the synthesis. Kyle, yes or no? She looked at him across the desk. In the torchlight, her expression had the quality of something carefully assembled. Each component in its right place. None of it false exactly, none of it entirely true. He had admired this quality for 2 years. He was not sure now what he had been admiring. There were inconsistencies in some of the sourcing, she said carefully. I made judgments about what was meaningful and what was noise. That is what intelligence work requires. Those are a lot of words, he said. For yes. She set down her cup. What I did for this kingdom. You did it for yourself. He said it without heat, which made it land harder than anger would have. You've been doing it for yourself since you arrived at this court, and I let you because you were useful and because I was... He stopped. The end of that sentence had too many rooms in it, and he wasn't ready to open them. Get out. Kyle, get out of my study. She left. The cups sat on the desk. He looked at the rejection document and at the blood signature and at the cups for a long time. By morning, the survey team he'd dispatched to the Eastern District had sent back their first report. The withering was confirmed in 9 fields across 4 separate pack territories. Not disease, no biological vector, no identifiable cause. The soil tester, a dry-voiced woman who had spent 30 years reading land, had written 3 words at the bottom of her report and underlined them. The ground is grieving. Kael read those 3 words standing at his study window in the early morning light. He had grown up in this kingdom. He knew the old stories, not as belief, but as the particular cultural knowledge that lives in a place long enough to become part of its atmosphere. He knew the stories about the Luna Bond, that a true Luna was not a title, but a tether, that the land of a pack kingdom was not a metaphor when it responded to the presence or absence of the one it recognized as its own. He had called those stories superstition. He had called most things superstition that required him to credit something he couldn't control. He folded the survey report. He set it next to the rejection document. He looked at both of them together on the desk, the clinical language of the survey beside the blood-dark signature line, and something in his chest performed the specific contraction of a man who has been wrong in a way that cannot be corrected by simply changing his position. He called for Davin. Davin arrived within 10 minutes, which meant he had been close, which meant he had been anticipating the call. "You found her," Kael said. "Stonemark Crossing, then north into the Ashwin route." Davin set a folded paper on the desk. She didn't try to hide it. She moved like someone who knew where she was going and didn't care who knew she'd gone there. Kael opened the paper. A location. A settlement in the far northern territories, close to the border of what the old maps called the independent packs. Not a place of exile. Not a place of hiding. A place of arrival. "There's something else," Davin said. His voice had the quality of a man delivering information he has already decided he cannot not deliver. "The Eastern District Envoy Network. The pack families out there." He paused. 3 separate family heads have sent messengers north in the last 4 days. Not to the keep. North. Kael looked up. "They're not going to her," Davin said. "She's not at that settlement yet, far as we can tell, but they're going to where she's going, like they knew she was coming before she got there." The room was quiet. "Who told them?" Kael said. "Nobody told them." Davin met his eyes. "That's what I'm saying. They just knew." Kael stood very still. Outside the window, the sky was that particular winter-approaching gray that settled over Silverfang territory in mid-season, the color of something holding its breath. In the eastern fields, the soil was cold in a way it shouldn't be. In the western settlements, the water had dropped. In the corridor outside, a kitchen girl was learning to read from books left behind by a woman who had lived in this keep for 3 years without anyone adequately understanding what she was. And somewhere north of the Stonemark Crossing, Lyra Ashwin was moving through the cold morning toward people who were already traveling to meet her, guided by nothing he could name, pulled by something older than any decision he had made or could now unmake. He picked up the rejection document. He looked at the blood on the signature line one more time. Then he set it face down on the desk. "I need a horse ready by dawn," he said. Davin said, "Already is." He rode out at dawn the way Davin had said. Horse ready, sky the color of dirty iron, the kind of cold that gets into the joints before the body has finished waking up. He took 3 soldiers and told himself it was for safety on the northern road. It was not for safety on the northern road. It was because riding alone towards something you'd broken required a specific kind of courage he had not yet confirmed he possessed, and 3 soldiers at your back gave you something to look like while you figured it out. The Stonemark Crossing was 6 hours north. He pushed the pace. He had ridden this road before, years back, during the border negotiations that had eventually become the framework treaty with the independent northern packs. He remembered it as hostile terrain, the kind that made its distaste for outsiders physical. Narrow passes, rock faces that shed gravel unpredictably, wind that came from 4 directions at once and committed to none of them. He remembered thinking it was a landscape that suited people who didn't want to be found. He was beginning to understand that had been the wrong reading. The first hour was silence. His soldiers knew better than to talk when he wasn't talking. Davin had selected them for that quality among others. 3 men who understood that useful presence didn't require noise. Kael kept his eyes on the road and let his mind work. He kept returning to the soil report, the 3 underlined words. The ground is grieving. He had been Alpha King of Silverfang for 9 years. He had inherited a functioning kingdom and by most measures had maintained it, borders held, trade routes open.
the major pack alliances intact.
He had governed with the understanding that a kingdom was a machine with specific inputs and outputs, and that his function was to keep the inputs clean and the outputs predictable. He had believed that was what ruling was. He had not believed in the Luna bond the way the old stories described it. He had experienced the mate bond, the pull of it, the biological reality, but he had categorized it as instinct rather than infrastructure, something that mattered personally, not structurally. The survey report had the dry language of a professional who had seen enough to stop being surprised by most things, and even she had written those 3 words and underlined them. Not weather, not biology. Grief. He didn't know what to do with that yet. He kept writing. They reached the stone-marked crossing by midday. The crossing itself was a natural rock formation, 2 faces of granite that narrowed the road to single file before opening into the broader northern plateau. Someone had left a fire ring at the junction, recent ash in it, gray and cold. More than one party had passed through in the last few days. The ground at the crossing showed track marks, horses and boots, and the wider impression of a wagon that had been loaded heavy. Kael dismounted and crouched at the wagon tracks. The depth and spacing of them told him laden with supplies, not people. Someone was moving resources north, not just bodies. Pack families, one of his soldiers said. Not a question. Kael stood. How many? The soldier studied the tracks for a moment. Counting the horse prints, 4 or 5 separate parties. Maybe more coming through at different times. He remounted. Something was assembling in the north, and it was assembling around a woman who had been gone from Silverfang Keep for less than 2 weeks. That speed was not accident. That speed was the evidence of something that had been building for longer than he'd been paying attention to it. The way a river builds under ice, invisible and constant, until the ice breaks and the whole thing is already in motion. He pushed the pace harder. They were 4 hours past the crossing, the light beginning to go gray and thin when the rider found them. She came from the south, hard riding, foam on the horse's neck, the specific quality of urgency that meant she had not stopped since whenever she'd left. She pulled up at the sight of his party, and he saw her recognize him and recalibrate her approach in the space of a single breath. Young woman, dark-haired, wearing the insignia of the Silverfang Courier Service. "My lord," she said, "what is it?" She reached into her satchel and produced a sealed document. He looked at the seal. Brennan's personal mark, not the council seal. Private correspondence, not official record. He broke it open and read it on horseback in the last good light of the afternoon. Brennan had sent 3 pages. He read them twice. The first page was the result of the seal verification he had taken under advisement. One of the council clerks, not acting under official instruction, acting on personal conscience, which meant acting in defiance of the implicit pressure to leave it alone, had accessed the Greymore faction archive records held in the Keep's treaty storage and compared them against the seals on Seraphine's documentation. The seals did not match, not a small discrepancy, a total mismatch. The wax formulation, the press depth, the specific insignia cut, none of it corresponded to any Greymore document in the archive going back 12 years. The second page was Brennan's accounting of what he'd found when he started pulling on that thread. 3 of the anonymous witnesses had been identified through their handwriting. 2 of them were employed in administrative roles that reported directly to Seraphine's household. The third was a man who had received a significant land grant in the Eastern District 8 months ago, signed by Seraphine under a delegated authority that Kael had granted her for minor administrative matters, and that she had used, apparently, for something other than minor administrative matters. The third page was the shortest. Brennan had written it in the compressed style of a man who had been precise his whole life and was being precise now when precision was most difficult. She was innocent. The documentation was fabricated in full. The witnesses were compromised. The treason determination was fraudulent. He read that third page a third time. The horse moved under him and the cold came down from the north, and his soldiers were quiet in the way of men who could read a face even when the face wasn't turned toward them. He folded the pages and put them in his coat. He thought about Lara standing in the hall while he read Seraphine's documents. He thought about her asking to see them. He thought about her saying, "These are forged," with the flat certainty of someone who didn't need to argue a point they already knew the answer to. He thought about the blood on the signature line and what it had cost her to make that mark instead of fighting. The specific economy of a person who knows when fighting will cost more than it returns. Who knows when the most powerful thing is to simply leave? He had read that as defeat. He had been reading the wrong thing for 3 years. He turned the horse around. "Change of direction," he said. His lead soldier looked at him. "My lord?" "We're going back to the keep." The ride back was faster, not because the horse was fresher, it wasn't, but because something had shifted in his body, the specific reconfiguration that happens when a man stops moving towards something and starts moving against something. He had been riding north to find Lyra with the vague intention of what exactly? Bringing her back, explaining, asking something he hadn't yet put into words. He understood now that sequence was wrong. There was a thing that needed to happen before any of that, and it needed to happen in the keep, in front of the council, in the full architecture of the legal process that had been used to destroy her. He reached the keep at second watch, hard in, horse blowing steam in the courtyard torchlight. He was off the mount before the groom reached him. Seraphine was waiting in the main corridor. He stopped when he saw her. She had the quality of someone who had been waiting for a specific person and had prepared for the conversation. Composed, positioned slightly toward the light, wearing the particular expression of a woman ready to manage whatever he had come back carrying. She looked at his face, and her composure held for approximately 2 seconds. Then something behind it shifted. "You went north," she said. "I came back." K.L. Brennan's report. He said it flat. "The seals." Her chin came up. It was a small movement, involuntary, the physical reflex of a person whose prepared position has just become a prepared defense. The clerk who accessed those records acted outside. "The seals don't match anything in the Greymore archives. Not close, not matching with variants, total fabrication." He walked toward her and she held her ground, which he noted because it told him she'd decided to fight this rather than retreat. "2 of your witnesses work for your household. The 3rd was paid with a land grant you signed under authority I gave you. I acted on intelligence. You forged documents." His voice didn't rise. It went the other direction, lower, quieter, the specific register of a man who has passed through anger and arrived somewhere colder. "You bribed witnesses. You fabricated a treason charge against an innocent woman, and I signed the rejection papers without verifying a single thing you put in front of me. She was a liability. She was my mate." The words sat in the corridor between them. Seraphine's expression did something complicated. A sequence of adjustments, none of them landing on anything he could call honest. "You never valued her," Seraphine said, and there was something in it that was almost real. The bitterness of someone who had watched a dynamic for years and believed she understood it. "You treated her as furniture for 3 years. I gave you a way to formalize what you'd already decided." "You decided what I'd decided," he said. "That's different." "Is it?" The question was designed to land, and it did. He stood in the corridor with Brennan's 3 pages in his coat and the memory of blood on a signature line and the survey report's 3 underlined words, and he let the question land because he was done refusing to feel the weight of things. "It's different," he said, "because whatever I failed to give her was mine to fail at. What you did was take her right to fight it." He called the guards. The council session convened at first light, not scheduled, assembled by direct royal summons, which had not happened in Silverfang in 11 years, and which therefore brought every council member to the table within 40 minutes, including 2 who arrived still in their traveling clothes from the outer districts. Brennan was already seated when Kael walked in. Their eyes met across the table, and Brennan gave a single small nod, the acknowledgement of a man who had been waiting a long time for this particular morning. Seraphine was brought in under escort. She walked to her chair with her composure intact, or something that looked like composure from the outside. Kael watched her hands when she sat and saw the controlled precision of them. Fingers flat on the table, not gripping it, the specific discipline of someone using physical control to manage what their face couldn't afford to show. He laid Brennan's report on the table. He laid the archive comparison documentation beside it. He laid the land grant record with Seraphine's signature on it, and the correspondence trail that Brennan's clerk had pulled in the hours between sending the courier and this morning, correspondence that showed the timeline of the fabrication going back 9 months. 9 months, 4 months before the accusation was ever made, which meant the accusation had not been a response to anything Lyra had done. It had been a plan constructed around a conclusion already reached. He read the summary aloud. The room was very still. When he finished, Seraphine said, "I want to speak." "You'll have the opportunity to speak at the formal hearing," Kael said. "I want to speak now." Her voice had the precise quality of someone who knows they are losing ground and is choosing which ground to defend. "Everything I did because this kingdom needed someone in that position who understood power. Lyra Ashwin was innocent," Brennan said. One word, the weight of a man who had been in these rooms for 40 years and had calibrated exactly how much force a single word needed to carry. Seraphine looked at him. Then she looked at Kael. "You'll never find her now," she said. And it was not a threat. It was something more uncomfortable than a threat. It was a fact she was offering him because she understood that facts were the only currency she had left. "She's been gone 2 weeks. The North will have her by the time your process finishes. And when you come to her with your verified documents and your council determination, she will look at you the way I watched her look at you before she left, like you are a lesson she already finished learning." The silence that followed was the longest one in the room. He did not respond to it. He looked at the guards and gave the instruction, and Seraphine was escorted from the chamber, and the council began the formal process, and all of it was correct and necessary, and none of it touched the things she had said. Because she was right. He knew she was right. The process would take days, like evidence review, formal charges, the documentation of the full scope of the fabrication for the Interpack record. It was not optional. It was not something he could shortcut without making the wrong even worse, without turning justice into another version of the same autocratic speed that had let the original injustice happen. He had acted fast and unilaterally when Seraphine had wanted him to. He would not do that again. But every hour the process ran, Lyra was further north. And somewhere out there, in the cold and the distance he had created, something was assembling around her. Pack families, grain envoys, people who had traveled without being told to travel, pulled by something older than his kingdom's politics. He had sent her out of Silverfang with a blood signature and a sum of coin and 3 years of being made to feel small. And she had walked north, and the land had started dying behind her. He sat at the head of the council table and watched Brennan begin the formal record and understood, with the specific clarity of a man who has been wrong in a way that restructures everything, that the kingdom he thought he had built was never as solid as the thing he had discarded. The ground was grieving, and he had no idea yet whether she would ever stop. The council process took 4 days. Kael did not sleep well for any of them. He sat through each session with the specific discipline of a man who has decided that patience is the only form of respect left available to him, watching the clerks read the documentation into the record, watching the timeline of Seraphine's fabrication get laid out in sequence, watching the council members absorb what 9 months of calculated manipulation looked like when you spread it flat on a table and looked at all of it at once. There was no satisfaction in it. Satisfaction would have required that the outcome fix something, and he understood with increasing clarity that the outcome fixed nothing in the direction that mattered. Seraphine sat through the first 2 sessions with her composure mostly intact. By the 3rd session, it had begun to show its seams, not in anything she said, but in the quality of her stillness, which had shifted from controlled to rigid. The difference between a person holding themselves together and a person gripping the pieces. On the 4th day, she stopped speaking entirely, which Brennan noted for the record in the precise, neutral language of a man who had stopped being surprised by people a long time ago. The determination came down on the morning of the 5th day. Stripped of rank. Stripped of the land holdings granted under the fraudulent authority. Exile from Silverfang territory and all allied packlands within the primary treaty network. The council voted unanimously, which was itself a kind of verdict, not just on Seraphine, but on the 9 months of pressure and reorganization that had made every person in that room complicit, by silence, if not by action, in what had happened to Lyra Ashwin. Kael signed the exile order and watched Seraphine be escorted from the chamber for the last time. She looked at him as she reached the door. Her expression had the quality of something stripped clean, none of the performance left, just the face of a woman who had spent a decade building towards something and had arrived at its exact opposite. He did not look away from it. He owed her that much honesty, the refusal to pretend it wasn't what it was. The door closed. Brennan set a second document on the table in front of him. Kael looked at it. "The Interpack Council," Brennan said. "They've requested a formal session. The determination on Lady Ashwin needs to be presented publicly, with the evidence, before the full assembly of Alpha representatives, not just Silverfang record, Interpack record." Kael had expected this. When? They've already called it, 12 days from now. The location... Brennan paused in the way of a man delivering information he has already decided to deliver without commentary. They've requested it be held at the Northmark Assembly Ground. Northmark was 3 days north of the Stonemark Crossing. It was, as far as his scouts had been able to determine, approximately 4 hours from where Lyra was. Kael sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he picked up the pen and signed the Interpack Council acknowledgement. He left for the north the same afternoon with Davin and 6 soldiers and the full evidentiary record in a locked case that Brennan had personally sealed. The road north was different this time. Not the weather. The weather was colder, the season further in, the passes showing the first ice on their faces. What was different was him. He had ridden north 11 days ago with the vague momentum of someone in motion toward a decision not yet made. He was riding north now with the specific weight of a man who had made every decision available to him and understood that the only one remaining was not his to make. He had spent the 4 days of the council process rebuilding the Eastern District grain allocation from the Keep's emergency reserves. He had dispatched surveyors to the western water tributaries and authorized engineering work to assess the drop in flow. He had sat with 3 pack family heads who had come to the Keep after Lyra's departure, not with complaints, with a kind of quiet, patient accountability, the way people look at a man they have decided to give one more chance to at significant personal cost. He had listened to all of them without speaking until they were finished. He had given direct answers to direct questions, which was new in these interactions, and which they had received with the particular wariness of people who had learned not to trust directness from above. The land had not recovered. The soil surveyors reported no improvement in the eastern fields. The water had not come back up in the western tributaries. Whatever was happening in the ground of Silverfang territory was not something that responded to resource allocation and engineering surveys. He had not expected it to. He had dispatched those responses because they were the correct administrative actions, and because doing the correct administrative actions was what he had left to offer, while the thing that actually needed doing remained out of his reach. 2 days north of the Stonemark Crossing, his scout came back from the morning ride with a report that stopped the column. "There's a gathering," the scout said. He was a young man, steady enough, but his voice had the particular quality of someone describing something he doesn't have an existing category for. "At the valley clearing before Northmark. Pack families, but not just the Northern Independents. Eastern District families, outer settlement packs, families I recognize from 6 different territories." He paused. "They're not traveling, my lord. They're settled. They've got structures up. They've been there days." "How many?" "Several hundred, maybe more further back in the tree line." He hesitated. "They're not armed. Nothing like a war camp. It's more like..." He stopped again. "Like what?" Davin said. "Like a settlement," the scout said. "Like something that decided to be a place." Kael looked north. The sky was the hard white of deep winter threatening, the kind of sky that made distances look deceptive, things further than they appeared, or closer, the landscape refusing to give honest information. He thought about what Seraphine had said in the council corridor. "She'll look at you like you are a lesson she already finished learning." He had carried that sentence for 11 days. It had the specific quality of a thing that was true in a way that couldn't be argued with, only absorbed. He touched his heels to the horse and kept going. They came through the last pass before the valley as the afternoon light went flat and pale, and the gathering opened below them all at once. Not the way a camp opens, but the way a territory opens, something that had edges, an organization, and the particular atmosphere of a place that already knew what it was. Fires in ring patterns, structures built for weather, not just overnight stops. Children visible near the outer edge, which was the detail that landed hardest. Children meant families that had committed, not scouts. Pack representatives from territories he could identify by their colors and markings moving between the structures with the ease of people who had been sharing space long enough to stop checking each other's boundaries. And at the center of it, clearly, the focal point around which everything was organized the way iron filings organize around a source. A woman standing near the main fire with 3 pack elders and a younger man who Cale's mind identified, after a beat of delay, as the grain envoy Aldrich. Lyra. She was wearing a heavy northern cloak over plain dark clothing, her hair pulled back in the practical way of someone who had stopped performing anything. She was not performing anything. That was the thing he saw first, the complete absence of performance, not because she was guarded, but because she was fully present, the specific quality of a person who has arrived somewhere and stopped needing to be anywhere else. She was talking. All 3 elders were listening with the focused attention of people who consider the person speaking worth listening to. He did not call out. He rode down the slope at a pace that announced arrival without announcing urgency, and the settlement saw him before he reached the valley floor. Sentries at the perimeter, pack members near the outer fires, and a specific quality of alertness moved through the gathering like wind through grass. Not panic, not aggression. Just the heightened awareness of something that understood what was coming in. By the time he reached the main fire, Lyra had turned. She looked at him. He looked at her. She was the same and not the same. Something had settled in her in 3 weeks that had not been there before, or had been there and been kept compressed under the pressure of 3 years in a court that didn't want to see it. She looked like a person taking up the full amount of space they were entitled to, which sounds simple and is not simple at all, and he felt the sight of it in his chest in a way he did not have clean language for. The bond was still there. Faint. 3 weeks of legal dissolution working on something that didn't care about legal frameworks, but there. He felt it the way you feel the heat from a fire when you've walked cold for a long time. Involuntary recognition, the body answering before the mind can frame a position. He dismounted. Aldrich had stepped forward, which took a specific kind of nerve that Cale noted and respected. The pack elders had drawn together slightly, not blocking, but present. The whole clearing had gone very still. "I'm here for the Interpack Council session," Cale said. He kept his voice even. "Northmark Assembly, 12 days from the call." "That's 4 days from now," one of the elders said. His name was Cord, white-haired, the senior representative of the Northmark Independents, a man who had been running his own pack territories since before Cale's father took the Silverfang throne. "I rode fast," Cale said. Cord looked at him with the assessment of a man who has spent a lifetime reading the gap between what people say and what they mean. "You came early." "I had things to say before the formal session." Cord looked at Lyra. Lyra looked at Cale. "You can say them," she said. Her voice was the same. That was somehow the worst part. Not changed, not hardened into something unfamiliar. Just steady, the way it had always been steady in the rooms of his keep when he hadn't been listening to it. He reached into his coat and took out Brennan's sealed summary, the condensed version, 6 pages, everything that mattered. He held it out. She did not take it immediately. She looked at it, then at him. "What is this?" she said. "The Council Determination on Seraphine Vale. Formal record. Complete evidentiary summary." He kept his arm out. The seals on her documentation were fabricated. The witnesses were compromised. 2 employed by her household, 1 paid with a fraudulent land grant. The timeline goes back 9 months. The treason determination has been formally vacated and the full record has been submitted for Interpack review. The clearing was silent enough that the fire crackle was the loudest sound in it. "She's been exiled, Beth," he said, "stripped of rank and holdings. The council voted unanimously." Lyra took the document. She held it without opening it and looked at him with an expression he couldn't fully read. Not the relief he had expected, or not only that. Something more complicated and more honest. 11 days, she said. The process, 11 days since she was caught, and you're here. She was not angry. The lack of anger was somehow harder to stand than anger would have been. The day after the rejection papers were signed, 2 families in the Eastern District lost their first fields to withering. In 11 days, it spread to 14 territories. She paused. I've had 9 separate PAC representatives reach me out here asking what they should do about land that's been dying since I left. I know. Do you know why? He held her gaze. I have theories. Tell me your theories. This was not a private conversation. It had not been a private conversation since the moment he rode into the valley. The PAC elders, Aldrich, the 100-some people near enough to hear, the others further back who could read the shape of an exchange, if not the words. He understood that was correct. He had made his decisions in private for 3 years, and they had cost everyone around him. Accountability required an audience. The Luna bond isn't just personal, he said. I treated it like it was. I treated everything about you like it was a personal matter, but something contained between the two of us. Something I could manage by managing how I behaved in private. I didn't understand that what you were doing here was structural. The territories responded to you the way they respond to a Luna because you were functioning as one. The Eastern District, the water allocations, the PAC family networks. You were holding load-bearing weight in this kingdom for 3 years, and I categorized it as... He stopped. The end of that sentence was the most honest and most difficult thing he could say in this clearing, and he said it. I categorized it as nothing important. Lyra was quiet. The land is responding to your absence, he said. Not as a metaphor. The surveyors can't find a biological cause. The withering is spreading in the same pattern as the territory you covered in your Eastern District visits. The water drop aligns with the routes you used. He breathed. You were the Luna of Silverfang, not by title, by function, by 3 years of quiet, unrecognized work that I permitted to continue without acknowledgement because it was convenient to have someone doing it. Something moved through her expression, not forgiveness, which would have required an invitation he hadn't offered yet. Something closer to the particular movement of a person who has been heard after a long time of not being heard, which is not the same as relief. Closer to exhaustion finally allowed to exist. Kael, she said. I know, he said. I know what I'm asking. You haven't asked anything yet. I know that too. Cord cleared his throat. The formal session is in 4 days, he said. The evidence will be presented before all signatories. Whatever else needs to be said. He looked at both of them with the tired wisdom of a man who has watched young people complicate simple things for 60 years. Say it after the record's been set. Kael nodded. He looked at Lyra one more time. She was holding Brennan's summary against her side, not reading it, looking at him with the particular steadiness of a woman who has survived something and come out the other side not smaller but differently shaped around what she now knew she was capable of, rather than around what someone else had told her she was for. He did not know what she would decide. He had spent 9 years knowing what everyone in his kingdom would do because he had controlled the conditions under which they made their choices. He had no control over this. He had destroyed every mechanism by which he might have had influence over this, and what remained was nothing but her own will applied to her own life. That was terrifying in a way that border disputes and drought reports and council challenges had never been terrifying. Those things had threatened the kingdom. This threatened something he didn't have a clean word for yet, something more like the architecture of who he actually was when you stripped away the title and the court and the 9 years of managed authority. He turned and handed his horse to Davin and went to find somewhere to sleep in the settlement that had built itself around the woman he had failed. Behind him, he heard Cord say something low to Lyra. He heard her respond. He could not make out the words. He made himself keep walking. 4 days. The formal session. The evidence laid out before every Alpha representative in the Northern Treaty Network. Irrefutable, exhaustive, the full anatomy of what had been done to her and what he had allowed and what he had finally, too late and too slowly, begun to dismantle. And after that, whatever she chose. The wind came down from the north, and the settlement fires held against it, and somewhere in the tree line, more pack families were still arriving, still finding their way to this valley, still moving toward the woman at the center of it, with the instinctive orientation of people who know what they're moving toward, even when they can't name why. The ground had been grieving, but standing in this valley, in the specific warmth of several hundred fires burning together against the dark, Kyle felt something shift in the cold. Not warmth returning, not yet. Something more like the land catching its breath. Waiting. The interpack session was in 4 days, and when it ended, and every alpha in the Northern Treaty Network had heard the full record, and justice was formally and publicly established in a way that no court could redact and no future documentation could obscure, Lyra Ashwin would stand before all of them with the truth behind her like bedrock. And Kyle Thornridge would stand before her with nothing. He did not know yet if nothing was enough, but for the first time in 9 years, he understood that not knowing was the correct position, that a man who was certain of the outcome before the choice was made had never actually surrendered anything. He stood in the valley, and the cold came down and the fires burned, and tomorrow he would face her again, and the day after that, and on the 4th day she would face every alpha in the Northern Network and make her case, and he would sit at that table as one voice among many, not the voice that decided, not the authority that adjudicated, just a man who had been wrong and knew it and had to live inside that knowledge until someone decided what it was worth, whatever she decided. He pressed his fist once against his sternum, the bond still there, faint as an ember, holding, and waited for the morning to come. The morning of the interpack session came in cold and clear, the kind of winter morning that had no ambiguity in it, sharp light, hard shadows, every edge of the world defined. Kyle had not slept well. He had slept in a tent on the settlement's eastern edge, a spare structure one of Cord's people had offered without ceremony, and he had lain awake for most of the dark hours doing the thing he had spent 9 years avoiding, accounting, not of resources or territory or political leverage, of himself. The specific inventory of a man taking honest stock of what he had done with the time and authority he'd been given, without the softening of justification, without the escape of blame distributed to circumstance. It was an uncomfortable process. He had known it would be. He had put it off for that reason with the efficiency of someone who understood instinctively that certain reckonings, once started, could not be managed. They had to be finished, all the way through, regardless of what the finishing cost. He was still working through it when the light came. He dressed in the cold and went out. The settlement was already moving, fires rebuilt from their overnight banking, people crossing between structures with the purposeful ease of a community that had found its rhythm. He watched it for a moment from the edge of his tent. 3 weeks. She had been here 3 weeks, and this was what had grown around her. Not by command, not by the architecture of authority he had spent 9 years constructing and defending, by the simpler and more durable mechanism of a person who showed up fully and consistently and let people decide for themselves what that was worth. He had shown up for 9 years with authority and withheld himself. She had shown up for 3 weeks with nothing but her own presence. The settlement around him was the difference between those two approaches made visible and measurable. He went to find water to wash his face and get ready for the session. The Northmark Assembly Ground was a wide, natural clearing half a mile from the settlement, ringed by old stone markers that predated any current pack territory claim. Neutral ground, recognized as such across 6 generations of interpack history. By the time Kyle arrived, the representatives were already seated in the curved arrangement that the assembly format required. 12 alpha representatives from the Northern Independent Packs, 4 from the Eastern District Territories, 2 from the Western Settlements, and 3 from the Silver Fang allied packs who had ridden north in response to the council summons. Brennan was there. He had ridden north himself 3 days hard, and he looked it. Tired around the eyes, back straight anyway. The specific posture of a man who understood that some things required physical presence regardless of the personal cost. He gave Kyle a nod when he sat. Nothing more. Lyra sat at the far end of the curved arrangement, not at the center. She had positioned herself as a participant, not a petitioner. That distinction was visible and deliberate. She was not here to ask for anything. She was here to be present while the record was established, which was a different thing entirely. She was wearing the same dark clothing as yesterday, Her hands were in her lap, still. She was looking at the stone markers at the edge of the clearing with the expression of someone who has made their peace with the shape of the day ahead and is conserving what they have for what the day actually requires. Cord opened the session with the traditional acknowledgement of the assembly ground and its neutrality. Then he looked at Kael. The Silver Fang King has requested this session to present a formal determination, Cord said. The assembly will hear the full record. Questions will be taken in order. The record will be entered into the Interpack archive without redaction. He paused. Begin. Kael stood. He had prepared what he was going to say. He had prepared it across 4 days of council process and 3 nights of bad sleep in a tent on the settlement's eastern edge. And he understood as he stood up that prepared words were the wrong tool for this. Prepared words were what a man used when he needed to manage an outcome. He was not here to manage an outcome. He was here to tell the truth in front of everyone who needed to hear it, including the people it cost him the most to tell it in front of. He put the prepared notes face down on the stone in front of him. Lyra Ashwin was my fated mate, he said. She was my mate for 3 years, and I governed my kingdom as if she were furniture. I did not do this from cruelty. I want to be honest about that because it matters. I did it from a failure of perception that I maintained willfully because correcting it would have required me to admit I had been wrong, and I'd built my entire model of leadership on the premise that I was not wrong. That's not an excuse. It's the mechanism. You can't fix a mechanism you won't name. The assembly was quiet. Not the polite quiet of an audience waiting to respond. The deeper quiet of people receiving something unexpected. 11 weeks ago, a member of my court presented fabricated documentation to my counsel accusing Lyra Ashwin of treason. The documentation was forged. The witnesses were compromised. I accepted it without independent verification because it confirmed a conclusion I had already been moving toward, that she was a complication rather than a foundation. He breathed. I signed rejection papers. She signed them in her own blood and left my kingdom without speaking a further word to me. I told myself it was relief. He heard something shift in the assembly lab. Not sound exactly, more the particular atmospheric change of a room in which something true has just been said. The treason determination has been formally vacated by unanimous council vote. The full evidentiary record is in this packet. He held up Brennan's sealed documentation. The party responsible has been stripped of rank and exiled under the full authority of Silver Fang law. I'm requesting that the Interpack Assembly enter this record into the permanent archive so that what was done to Lyra Ashwin cannot be quietly revised by whoever controls the Silver Fang record in future generations. He sat down. Cord said, "Are there questions for the Silver Fang King?" There were questions, 12 of them, from 9 different representatives, each one precise and without mercy in the way that honest accountability requires precision without mercy. He answered all of them. He did not redirect, did not qualify beyond what was accurate, did not use the passive voice that had been available to him for every question, the passive voice that would have let him say mistakes were made instead of I made this mistake, and here is exactly how and why. By the time the questions finished, the light had moved across the clearing and the cold had settled deeper. His back ached from the tense, hard ground the night before. And there was a specific exhaustion behind his eyes that came from the kind of honesty that uses the same muscles as physical work. Cord looked at Lyra. Does the assembly have anything to hear from Lyra Ashwin? Lyra stood. She looked at the assembly for a moment without speaking, which was not hesitation. It was the beat of a person choosing exactly where to begin. I want the record to reflect that I am not here as a victim seeking remedy, she said. The remedy I needed was the one I gave myself when I walked out the east gate. What I need from this assembly is simpler. I need the record to exist so that the next woman in my position, in any pack, under any alpha, on any territory covered by this assembly's authority, has a precedent she can point to. Not a story, a legal record, evidence-based, formally entered, permanently retrievable. She reached into her satchel and set a second document on the stone in front of her. I've drafted a proposed amendment to the Interpack Treaty, she said, specifically to the section governing mate bond disputes and treason determinations. It requires independent verification of any evidence before a rejection or exile determination can be finalized. It requires that any anonymous witness in a criminal proceeding be disclosed to a neutral third-party verifier, even if their identity is protected from the accused, and it requires that any evidence used in a mate bond dissolution be preserved in the Interpac archive for a minimum of 50 years. She looked at Cord. I would like this assembly to consider it. Cord looked at the document. He looked at the other representatives. He said, We'll consider it. He meant it. Kyle could hear that he meant it. So could everyone else in the clearing. Lyra sat down. The session ran another 2 hours. The formal entry of the evidentiary record, the review of the proposed amendment, the specific procedural discussions that Interpac governance required. Cale participated where his participation was required and stayed silent where it wasn't. He watched Lyra across the curved assembly. The way she answered procedural questions with the same directness she'd used in his council chamber for 3 years. The way the Northern representatives spoke to her with the default respect of people who had already decided what she was worth before she opened her mouth. The way she held the weight of the session without visible strain. She had always been like this. He had looked at it and seen something small. When the session closed, the representatives dispersed in pairs and small groups. Cord clasped Lyra's forearm in the pack elder's acknowledgement, not a courtesy gesture, the real one, and said something in her ear that Kyle couldn't hear. She nodded. Kyle did not move from his position until the assembly ground had mostly cleared. Then he crossed it. She watched him come. She did not arrange her expression for him, didn't harden it or soften it, just let him see it as it was, tired, clear-eyed, complete in the way of a person who has finished a necessary thing and is breathing at the end of it. He stopped 3 feet from her. The amendment will pass, he said. Probably, she said. It should have existed already. A lot of things should have existed already. She looked at him. That's not an accusation, it's just true. He looked at the stone markers at the edge of the clearing. The old ones, pre-territorial, the kind that had been placed by people whose names nobody remembered anymore. He had always found old things like that unsettling, evidence of how little any individual decision persisted against time. He found them less unsettling now. Something about the last 3 weeks had adjusted his relationship with what lasted and what didn't. I'm not going to ask you to come back, he said. She was quiet, watching him. I spent 4 days riding here trying to figure out how to ask you to come back, and I understood somewhere on the second day that asking you to come back was still the wrong question. It was still about what I needed from you, what I wanted to repair. He looked at her. What I owe you is not a request. What I owe you is to make the kingdom worth coming back to. Not for me, not to fix what happened between us, but because you spent 3 years doing the work of it, and the people there deserve what you were building for them. Something moved through her expression. Not surprise. More like the specific recognition of a person hearing something they had been waiting a long time to hear. Not because they needed it to proceed, but because its arrival confirmed something about the shape of the world. The Eastern District families, she said. I've authorized the full grain reserve release. The water surveys are ongoing. I'm restructuring the council. Brennan will chair it. Not advisory authority. Real authority with override capacity. He paused. I should have done that years ago. I didn't because it required trusting that I could be wrong and still be useful. She looked at him for a long moment. Can you? I don't know yet, he said. I think learning that is going to take longer than I want it to. The honesty of it landed between them. Not comfortable, not warm. Something harder and more durable than warmth. The Northern Alliance is going to be formalized, she said. The Pack families here, the Eastern District families that came north. We're not going back under the old treaty structure. What's being built here is going to be its own thing. She held his eyes. I'm going to be part of building it. I know. That's not a rejection of you, she said. I want to be clear about that. It's not about you. She said the last words carefully, with the precision of someone who has thought about the difference between those two things for a long time. It's about what I can build when I'm not spending 3/4 of my energy managing someone else's court. He absorbed that. He let it sit exactly as heavy as it was. Is the bond... He stopped, started differently. What's left of the bond, does it? It's there, she said, quieter. It's been 3 weeks. She looked at the clearing, at the stone markers, at the winter sky above them. I don't know what it means yet. I'm not going to know for a while. And I'm not going to make any decisions based on it while I'm still figuring out what I'm building up here. That's fair, he said. It's honest, she said. Fair is a different thing. He almost smiled. He saw her see it, and something shifted briefly in her expression. The ghost of the dynamic they had never actually allowed themselves to have. The one where they were equal enough to find each other's particular qualities worth something. He reached into his coat and took out the original rejection document. He had carried it north without quite knowing why. The same instinct that had kept it on his desk, face down, not filed away. He held it out to her. She looked at it. Then she took it. She looked at the blood on the signature line for a long moment. Then she folded it once and set it on the stone marker beside her. Not a ceremony, just a placement. The specific gesture of putting something down that you've been carrying. Go back to Silverfang, she said. Fix what's broken there. Not for me. For the people who need it fixed. And after that, she looked at him. After that, I'll know better what I want to say to you, and you'll know better whether you're someone different enough to hear it. He stood in the cold clearing and looked at her. This woman who had spent 3 years in his court being made small, and had walked out of it, and built something in 3 weeks that would outlast any decision he made today. He understood, standing there, that the thing he had lost was not a possession. You could not lose what you had never genuinely held. What he had lost was the version of his life in which he was the kind of man who deserved what had been offered to him, and that version was not coming back. What was available to him was the harder thing, becoming someone who might deserve something new. Not the same. New. Built from what he now knew about the weight of what he'd discarded, and the specific courage it took to set a document on a stone and turn away from it without looking back. He had not known that courage when he watched her do it. He knew it now. He picked up the document from the stone. She watched him. He walked to the nearest fire at the edge of the clearing, one of the settlement fires, burning steady against the winter, and held the rejection paper to the flame until it caught, and held it until the blood signature and the legal language and the 3 years of cold governance it represented had burned down to ash that the wind took before it touched the ground. He did not watch it go. He turned back to the clearing. Lyra was still standing at the stone marker. She had watched him do it. Her expression was not soft. It was the expression of a woman who has survived something and is measuring what comes after with the same precision she used for everything. He nodded to her once. She held his gaze for a moment, not a concession, not a promise, an acknowledgement, the specific acknowledgement of two people who have been through something together and separately and are not yet sure what that builds into, but are no longer pretending it isn't there. He walked back through the clearing. Daven was waiting at the northern edge with the horses and the sense of a man who had been with Kael long enough to read the shape of a moment without needing it explained. They rode south. The road back to Silverfang was the same road in both directions, but it felt entirely different going back. Not better. Different in the way that all journeys feel different when you know what you've left behind and are no longer pretending you haven't left it. The cold was the same cold. The sky was the same hard winter white. The passes were the same passes. He was not the same man. That was not a triumphant observation. There was nothing triumphant about understanding, at 36 years old, that you had governed your own life the way a man governs a kingdom he has never actually walked through. From above, from distance, from the comfortable position of someone who has confused authority with understanding. The understanding came after the loss. That was the order it always came in, for people who waited until something was gone to acknowledge what it was worth. He could not recover what he had lost. He could stop losing more things the same way. The kingdom was waiting. The eastern fields still held their cold. The water was still low in the western tributaries. The council under Brennan's new authority would need to be constituted properly, with the specific care of building something designed to outlast the preferences of whoever happened to be sitting at the head of the table on any given day. There was work to do, real work, the kind that didn't announce itself as meaningful, but was meaning made structural. The grain that reached families before the hard frost, the water that ran where it was supposed to run, The disputes resolved before they became wounds that lasted a generation. He thought about Lyra walking the Eastern District in the planting seasons before she had been quietly prevented from going, walking the fields, sitting with the families, putting her hands in the ground and paying attention. The pack elders had said the land remembered. He had called that superstition. He understood now that some things that looked like superstition were the oldest form of observation, that the land responding to her absence was not metaphor. It was the accumulated record of 3 years of someone showing up and being present, made physical, made undeniable, made into something that could not be replaced by a resource allocation document or an engineering survey, no matter how correct they were. What she had done could not be replaced, but what she had done could be continued, not by him, not the way she had done it, not with the specific quality she carried, but the structures she had been building informally could be made formal. The relationships she had kept alive in the Eastern District could be maintained by a council that understood their value. The amendment she had drafted that morning would change the legal architecture of every territory in the Interpack network, and that change would outlast both of them. She had been building a legacy in the spaces he had dismissed as small. He rode south with the wind at his back and the cold settling into the muscle of his shoulders and the specific clarity of a man who has stopped managing the distance between himself and what's real. South of the Stonemark Crossing, at the junction where the road split east toward the outer settlements, he stopped the column. He looked east. The Eastern District families, the ones who had sent their grain envoys to the keep for years, the ones who had ridden north toward Lyra without being told to, the ones who had watched the fields go cold and waited, were out there, working, managing, surviving with or without the keep's acknowledgement of what that survival cost them. He turned the column east. Davin raised an eyebrow. Eastern District first, Kyle said. The capital can wait a day. Davin said nothing. He turned his horse east. They rode toward the fields. Years later, people who were there would say the land came back slowly. Not the way it had been before, exactly, but differently. New patterns in the soil. Water running in courses that hadn't existed before the withering, as if the ground had used the absence to reconfigure something. The Eastern families said the new growth was stronger than the old. The pack elders said the land had learned something from its grief. Kale never claimed credit for the recovery. When council historians asked him what had turned the territory around, he said the same thing every time. In the flat, unembellished language he had learned was the only kind worth using. A woman named Lyra Ashwin built the foundation of this kingdom before I understood that was what she was doing. Everything that recovered because she had built something worth recovering toward. He never remarried. He never sought another mate bond. He served as Alpha King for 11 more years, during which the Reformed Council under Brennan's authority expanded to include pack family representatives from 6 territories. The Eastern District established a self-governing assembly that fed its decisions upward rather than receiving them from above. And the Silverfang Kingdom was recognized 3 times in successive interpack assemblies as the most stable territory in the Northern Treaty Network. It was not the legacy he had imagined for himself at 27. It was the one he had earned. In the north, the alliance that Lyra built at Northmark grew into something the maps eventually had to rename. Her territory flourished in the way that things flourish when they are built from the ground up by someone who understands that power is not the accumulation of authority, but the distribution of conditions in which people can become what they are capable of becoming. Pack families came to her not because she demanded loyalty, but because she offered something rare and more durable. The specific dignity of being seen clearly and trusted accordingly. She did not call herself a queen for a long time. When she finally accepted the title, she was standing in the middle of the Northern Assembly, not at its head, and she said, "This is a description, not an elevation. I'm the same person I was before this word existed for me." The people around her had laughed. She had too. The bond between her and Kyle dissolved fully over the years, the way the old magic worked. Slowly, without announcement, the string going quiet rather than breaking. She felt the last of it one morning in her 5th year at Northmark, standing in the field outside the settlement with her hands in the soil. A warmth she recognized, and then its absence. She stood there for a while after, in the particular silence of something that had been present for a long time becoming memory. She was not sad. She was not glad. She was the person who had survived the thing that had tried to make her small and had come out the other side knowing exactly what she was made of. That knowledge did not need a bond to hold it. She pressed her hands deeper into the earth. The soil was warm. The land recognized her, the way it always had, the way it always would. Not because of blood or title or the ancient mechanics of a mate bond, but because she had shown up for years in all weather and paid attention and done the work. The morning was cold and clear, and the northern light was coming through the tree line at the angle that made everything look like the beginning of something. She stood up. She brushed the soil from her palms. She went back to work.